All right, welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Today, we're going to try to unpack a period of, really explosive growth in Christian history, a period often called, the Great Century. We're talking about the years from 1792 to 1910, a time when Christianity spread further and faster than probably any other time in history.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
So think of this as your crash course. Our guide for this deep dive is 043 The Great Century and Beyond.pdf, and we're going to try to pull out the most important stuff, the real game changers that made this period so significant.
And it is significant. By the late 1700s, Christianity had already, kind of made its way to 5 continents thanks to various earlier missionary movements. But then something really shifted in the 19th century. It's like someone lit a fire under it.
Exactly. And a big part of that fire, according to our source, were these Protestant missionaries. They were driven by, all these new ideas and movements, the Pietist movement in Europe, these huge evangelical awakenings in Britain and America. It was a whole different ballgame compared to, how Roman Catholic missions were operating at the time.
Yeah, the Catholic Church had been involved in missions for centuries, of course, but they faced some real headwinds during this period. You had all the political upheaval from the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the rise of these new nation states. It really shook things up, especially for the old missionary orders.
And then you have the Enlightenment, this intellectual movement that really challenged traditional authority. I mean, it impacted everything, including how people viewed religion and missions.
So while Catholic missions were certainly still active, a lot of their focus shifted to, maintaining the missions they already had, training local clergy, things like that. The real explosion of new initiatives, the kind that really defined the 19th century, that came mostly from these energized Protestant groups.
And that's where this term missiological great century comes in. Our source uses it to describe the period from 1792, when William Carey founded the Baptist Missionary Society, all the way to 1910, the year of the First World Missions Conference in Edinburgh. And during those years, Christianity reached more corners of the world and more different kinds of people than ever before.
It wasn't just about making contact anymore. It was about planting seeds that would grow into these, vibrant, long-lasting communities of faith.
So how did this monumental movement get its start? Let's go back to Europe.
All right, so you can't talk about the Great Century without talking about William Carey. I mean, he's often called the father of modern missions, right?
Yeah, and for good reason. I mean, even though there were others before him, like you said, Carey was the one who really, got things organized and really got the whole movement going.
And what's even more remarkable is that he wasn't some, high-ranking church official or a scholar with tons of resources. He was just this regular Baptist pastor.
Yeah, a bivocational pastor at that,
Right.
Which meant he had to work another job to support himself and his family.
And he used to be a member of the Church of England before converting to the Baptist faith. He was self-taught when it came to languages and even botany.
Yeah, a real Renaissance man. But his passion for languages, for understanding different cultures, that was, I guess you could say that was really ignited by earlier missionaries like John Eliot, who worked with Native Americans in New England, and David Brainerd, who ministered to Native American tribes further inland.
Exactly. But what really set Carey apart was his, his unique blend of deep faith and serious intellectual curiosity. It wasn't just, emotional zeal. He was a deep thinker who could back up his convictions.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, his famous 1792 treatise, An Inquiry into the Obligation of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens, was like the intellectual foundation for the whole modern missionary movement. It was, like the blueprint,
It was groundbreaking, really. And it wasn't without its controversies. He was directly challenging this idea of hyper-Calvinism, which was pretty strong among the Baptists at the time.
Oh, yeah, that was a huge debate back then. Hyper-Calvinism, that's the belief that, human effort in salvation is basically unnecessary. God's going to do what God's going to do, and there's no need for us to, actively go out and try to convert people.
And many of his peers thought he was stepping way outside the theological boundaries. I mean, they were like, what are you doing, Carey? This isn't our job.
Right, but he very carefully dismantled those arguments. He went point by point, addressing all the objections people had to missionary work. And then he went even further, He actually proposed how to create an organization to do this work, to make it happen.
And his famous sermon, Attempt Great Things, Expect Great Things, that really helped to capture the imagination of people. It gave them, the emotional and spiritual drive to actually do something.
Yeah, and it wasn't just talk. Just 4 months after that sermon, the Baptist Missionary Society, or BMS, was born. And then in 1793, Carey and John Thomas, they set sail for India. It was the start of something truly remarkable.
And our source points to this moment as the real beginning of organized overseas missions from the English-speaking world.
But India was tough, right? I mean, it wasn't exactly a welcoming environment.
Definitely not a walk in the park. Carey faced all sorts of obstacles: political resistance, financial struggles that forced him to move further inland, personal tragedies. I mean, his son died, his wife suffered a mental breakdown. It was rough.
Yeah, it's hard to even imagine. But he persevered. He learned Bengali, and eventually in 1799, he teamed up with Joshua Marshman and William Ward in Serampore, forming what we now know as the Serampore Trio.
And that trio was incredibly productive. I mean, they were a powerhouse of missionary activity. And Carey, he didn't just go in blindly. He had this five-pronged strategy for missions that was really ahead of its time.
5 prongs. That's a lot more sophisticated than just showing up and preaching,
Oh,
right?
yeah, much more nuanced. His strategy included, widespread preaching, of course, but also translating and distributing the Bible in local languages, planting churches, studying non-Christian religions, and training local leaders. It was a really holistic approach.
So he wasn't just interested in converting individuals. He wanted to create like a self-sustaining Christian community.
Exactly. He understood that, lasting change required a deeper understanding of the culture and empowering local leadership. And his impact was huge. We're talking over 40 Bible translations, countless mission stations, grammars and dictionaries of local languages, and even contributions to social reform in India and things like agricultural science.
Wow, that's an amazing legacy. And I think one of his most important innovations was this idea of a society basis for missions.
Right. Because back then, the established churches in England, they weren't exactly jumping at the chance to, create and fund these big official mission organizations. So Carey figured out a way to work around that.
Yeah, he created this model of independent societies, organizations that relied on individual commitment and donations. It was a real game changer, and it's a model that still resonates today, with all sorts of grassroots movements.
Absolutely. It's about people coming together, pooling their resources, and driven by a shared passion rather than top-down bureaucracy. And the impact was immediate. I mean, right after Carey's BMS got going, you had a whole slew of new organizations popping up. The London Missionary Society, or LMS, the Scottish and Glasgow Missionary Societies, the Netherlands Missionary Society, the Church Missionary Society, also known as CMS, and the British Informed Bible Society.
So the floodgates were open. And the LMS, that was the first interdenominational one, right?
Yep. It brought together people from different Protestant denominations who were united by this, desire to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth. It was a sign of the growing momentum of the movement.
And alongside all this organizational growth, you had these incredible individuals, these pioneers who were pushing the boundaries and taking huge risks. Like, what about Henry Martyn? He was a chaplain with the East India Company, right?
Yeah, a brilliant linguist. And although he was Anglican, he formed a close partnership with the Serampore Trio. He completed New Testament translations in Urdu, Persian, and Arabic, which was, an incredible feat. Unfortunately, he died quite young, which was a huge loss to the mission field.
It's hard to imagine the dedication and sheer intellectual effort that went into those translations. And then you have Robert Morrison, the guy who basically opened up China to Protestant missions. Talk about an uphill battle.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, China was largely closed off to outsiders,
Yeah.
So Morrison had to be pretty resourceful. He ended up working for the East India Company in Macau just to gain a foothold. And it took him 17 years to complete his Chinese Bible translation.
17 years. Wow, that's some serious commitment. And I read that it took him 7 years to convert his first Chinese person to Christianity.
Talk about perseverance. But, even though those early efforts in China were slow and difficult, they laid the groundwork for what would become a massive expansion of Christianity in the country later on.
And then there were the early attempts to reach the South Sea Islands. Well, they didn't exactly go as planned at first, did they?
No, not at all. It was rough. In 1796, the LMS sent this big group of missionaries and their families, something like 30 people, to Tahiti, Tonga, and the Marquesas Islands.
Yeah.
But they were unprepared for the challenges they faced.
What kind of challenges?
Oh, all sorts. Disease, hostile indigenous populations, cultural misunderstandings. There were even instances of cannibalism in some of those islands. Many of the missionaries died, and some of those who survived ended up integrating into the local culture so much that they that they basically abandoned their mission.
So a lot of heartache and disappointment. It must have seemed like a total failure.
It did at the time, but even in those early failures, there were valuable lessons learned. They paved the way for later successes and, helped to shape a more culturally sensitive approach to missions in the region. And eventually, those islands would experience some truly remarkable transformations.
Transformations fueled, at least in part, by the sacrifices of those early missionaries. And speaking of challenging contexts, what about John Theodore Vanderkemp? He was another LMS pioneer, right? But he went to South Africa.
Yeah, he was quite a character. He was a former military officer who underwent a dramatic conversion experience and then dedicated his life to missions. He arrived in South Africa in 1799, right at the time when the British were expanding their colonial presence and clashing with the local Bantu and Hottentot populations.
And Vanderkemp, he didn't shy away from those conflicts. He became a strong advocate for the rights of the indigenous people, even establishing a refuge for the Hottentots who were fleeing violence. And he really ruffled some feathers when he decided to marry an African woman.
Yeah, he saw it as a way to bridge the cultural divide and identify more closely with the people he was trying to reach. But it caused a huge uproar among the British settlers and even within the LMS itself. Yeah. He was definitely a controversial figure, but he also had a deep commitment to social justice and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
So even in those early years, the missionary enterprise was full of complexities and contradictions. But the movement was gaining momentum, spreading across the Atlantic, too. How did the Americans get involved in all of this?
Well, the news of what Carey and the Serampore trio were doing in India, it really captivated the American imagination. And even though Carey was a Baptist, his vision for missions had a distinctly ecumenical flavor.
Ecumenical? You mean like reaching across denominational lines?
Exactly. He even proposed this idea of a global missionary conference back in 1810. Can you imagine that?
Oh, wow, yeah. Who would have been there? Would it have even been possible back then?
Well, it would have been a pretty mixed bag, for sure. You probably would have had, a good number of people from India, the West Indies, a smaller group from the Pacific Islands, but hardly anyone from Japan or Korea, very few from China or Southeast Asia, almost no one from the Muslim world or inland Africa.
And I guess given Carey's Protestant focus, probably no one from Central or South America.
Right. It really highlights how much the missionary landscape would change over the next 100 years.
So it was a very different world back then. And in America, overseas missions actually kind of grew out of their home mission efforts, their work with the frontier settlements and the Native American tribes. It wasn't always a clear distinction.
But Carey's example, his society basis model, it really sparked something in the States, especially among the students.
Yeah, there was this whole student movement in New England that was really fired up by what they were hearing about Carey and the missions in India. And that led to the creation of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, the ABCFM, in 1810.
And the ABCFM, they were primarily supported by the Congregationalists at first, but they were open to working with other denominations too, and they quickly sent out their first missionaries, including these two pivotal figures, Adoniram Judson and Luther Rice. And where did they send them? India, of course.
To work with Carey, right.
Exactly. But here's where the story takes a pretty dramatic turn. On their voyage to India, Judson and Rice, they were studying their Greek New Testaments, getting ready to, debate the finer points of baptism theology with the Baptists in India.
Okay, so they were going to have some friendly theological sparring with Carey and his crew.
Exactly. But the more they studied, the more convinced they became that the Baptist understanding of baptism was the right one. And this was a big deal back then.
Yeah, I mean, baptism was one of the major issues that divided Protestants. It was a huge theological sticking point.
So when they arrived in India, they were baptized by William Ward, one of the Serampore trio. And they realized they couldn't, in good conscience, continue working for the Congregationalist ABCFM. So they resigned. Judson decided to go to Burma instead, and Rice went back to the U.S. to rally support for their new Baptist convictions.
So a theological debate on a boat led to a major shift in American missions.
And Rice, he was a tireless advocate. He traveled all over the country, speaking at churches, organizing meetings, basically drumming up support for Baptist missions. And it worked. In 1814, he helped to establish the General Missionary Convention of the Baptist denomination in the USA for foreign missions, which later became known as the Triennial Convention.
So the American Baptists were officially in the game. And it seems like this denominational organizing really took off from there, right?
Yeah, it was like a domino effect. The American Bible Society was founded in 1816,
Okay.
and then boom, 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 you had all these other denominations getting in on the action. The Methodist Episcopal, Protestant Episcopal, Presbyterian, Evangelical Lutheran churches, they all started organizing their own mission boards.
Mhm.
And by the mid-19th century, American missions were really starting to take a leading role on the global stage.
It's amazing how quickly things were changing. And alongside all this organizational growth, you had these amazing individuals, these pioneers venturing into new fields and facing incredible challenges. Like, what about George Liele? He was the first American to go abroad and establish a church, right?
Yeah, and what makes his story even more remarkable is that he was a formerly enslaved man who had purchased his own freedom and then became a powerful preacher and missionary. He went to Jamaica in 1782, and he really laid the foundation for what would become a thriving Baptist community there.
And then there was Hiram Bingham and the ABC-FM mission to Hawaii in 1820. They actually found some existing Christian influence there brought by, I guess, by visiting merchants and traders.
Yeah, it was a fascinating situation. They had the support of some of the local chiefs, and then there was this powerful spiritual revival that really swept through the islands. The timing was perfect.
So it wasn't just about starting from scratch. It was about building on what was already there, working with the existing cultural and spiritual dynamics.
Exactly. And then you have these two incredible individuals, Lot Carey and Colin Teague. They were also formerly enslaved, and they pioneered Baptist missions in Liberia in 1821.
Wow, so they went back to Africa to spread the gospel. That's pretty powerful.
It really is. And they weren't just focused on evangelism either. Carey became involved in politics and even served as the governor of Liberia for a time. He was a true visionary.
And let's not forget about George Dana and Sarah Boardman. They went to Burma in 1827 to work among the Karen people, and their message really resonated with the Karen worldview.
Yeah, the Karen people had this ancient belief in a creator God and a lost sacred book. And when they heard the Christian message, it just clicked for them. It was like they'd found something they had been searching for.
So it was about finding those points of connection, those bridges between cultures and beliefs.
Absolutely. And the results were incredible. The Karen people became one of the largest Christian groups in Southeast Asia.
So we see the British sparking this global movement, the Americans jumping in with both feet. But what about other European missionary endeavors? What else was happening during this early period?
Oh, you had missions sprouting up all over. There was Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, where both British societies and the ABC-FM were active. But they faced pretty stiff resistance in that predominantly Buddhist culture. It was slow going.
Yeah, Buddhism had been deeply entrenched there for centuries. It wasn't easy to make inroads.
And then there was Sierra Leone, where German missionaries associated with the CMS were working. It was a really tough environment, especially in those early years. The mortality rate for Europeans in West Africa was incredibly high.
Yeah, disease was rampant back then. It was a huge risk to go to places like that.
But despite the dangers and the loss of life, they persevered. And one of their most significant contributions was the establishment of Fourah Bay College in 1827, which became a center for higher education for Africans.
Education was always a key part of the missionary enterprise, wasn't it? I mean, it was about more than just converting people. It was about, about equipping them to be leaders in their own communities.
Exactly. And in South Africa, you had these two really influential figures, Robert Moffat and John Phillip, both from the LMS. Moffat arrived in 1816, and he was this incredibly talented linguist. He became fluent in the local languages and established a mission among the Bechuana people.
And Philip, he was more of a social activist, right? He clashed with the Boer settlers over their treatment of the black population.
Yeah, he was a fierce advocate for the rights of the indigenous people. He spoke out against the injustices of colonialism and, really pushed for social reform. He was a thorn in the side of the colonial authorities, but he also made a lasting impact.
So two very different approaches to missions, but both driven by a deep sense of, of justice and compassion.
And then you have John Williams, the LMS missionary, who was instrumental in spreading the gospel throughout the Pacific South Seas. He was this incredibly energetic and adventurous guy who just couldn't stay put. He traveled from island to island, planting churches, training local leaders, translating the Bible. He was a real force of nature.
And he was tragically martyred in 1839 while trying to reach the people of Aramongo in the New Hebrides. Right?
Yeah, it was a huge loss. But ironically, his death actually inspired even more missionary activity in the region. It's like his sacrifice fueled the movement.
So even in death, he had a profound impact. And what about Alexander Duff? He was from the Church of Scotland, and he took a very different approach to missions, right?
Yeah, Duff arrived in Calcutta in 1830, And he was convinced that the best way to reach the high caste Hindus was through education, specifically English education. So he established a school that taught Western subjects alongside Christian teachings.
So a more intellectual approach, appealing to the minds of the elite.
Exactly. He wasn't necessarily seeing mass conversions, but he was planting seeds, laying the groundwork for a long-term transformation. And he later went on to establish a chair in evangelistic theology, which we now understand as the academic field of missiology. So he was really a pioneer in that regard.
So by the 1830s, the missionary movement was growing, expanding, reaching new corners of the globe. But there was also a lot of reflection and debate happening about the best ways to do this work, right?
Oh, absolutely. The early model of missions, which was often very paternalistic with missionaries controlling the purse strings and, calling all the shots, that was starting to be questioned. There was a growing sense that a more indigenous approach was needed, one that empowered local leaders and fostered self-sufficiency.
So a shift from dependence on Western missionaries to self-supporting, self-governing churches.
Exactly. And this shift was really championed by three key figures: Rufus Anderson, Henry Venn, and Francis Wayland. We can call them the Venn-Anderson-Wayland trio.
Catchy name. So who were these guys and what were their big ideas?
Well, Anderson was the senior secretary of the ABCFM in America. He was a big believer in the ultimate triumph of Christianity and the power of the Holy Spirit to work through local believers. He went on this big survey trip to Sri Lanka and India in the mid-1850s, and he came back convinced that the centralized mission stations, those big compounds where missionaries lived and worked, were actually creating dependency and hindering the development of truly indigenous churches. So he advocated for decentralizing those stations, establishing smaller, self-supporting village churches, ordaining local pastors, and emphasizing education in the vernacular languages.
So a more grassroots approach, empowering local communities.
Exactly. And Henry Venn, who was the General Secretary of the CMS in London, he came to very similar conclusions. He's famous for his 3-self formula for indigenous churches: self-supporting, self-governing, and self-propagating. Basically, he wanted to create churches that could stand on their own 2 feet without relying on Western missionaries.
It's like the old adage, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime.
Exactly. And Francis Wayland, he was a prominent Baptist leader in America, and he strongly supported these ideas. He was especially critical of this notion that missionaries needed to civilize non-Western cultures before they could be evangelized.
So he was challenging that idea that Christianity was somehow tied to Western culture and values.
Exactly. He believed in the power of the gospel to transform lives, regardless of cultural background. And these ideas, they weren't always well received at first. There was resistance from some missionaries who were used to doing things a certain way, but eventually these principles of indigenous church planting gained wider acceptance.
Although, as our source points out, the implementation of these ideas was sometimes complicated by, the realities of colonialism.
Yeah, that's a whole other layer of complexity. But these ideas didn't disappear. They were planted like seeds, and they would sprout again later on in the 20th century.
So it was a time of transition, of new ideas challenging old ways of thinking. And while all this was happening, what were some of the other key events and influential figures shaping the mission field during this period, from 1832 to 1865?
Well, in the American context, one of the biggest events was the formation of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1845. This split with the Northern Baptists was primarily over differing views on the best way to organize and support mission work. The Southerners favored a more congregational approach, relying on voluntary cooperation, while the Northerners preferred a more centralized system.
And of course, the issue of slavery was looming large in the background, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was a major contributing factor to the split, even if it wasn't the primary theological issue. And the Southern Baptists, they went on to establish their home and foreign mission boards, which have become some of the largest and most influential missionary organizations in the world.
And globally, there were a number of significant developments that opened up new possibilities for missions, like the demise of the East India Company in 1858.
Right, that was a huge turning point for missions in India. The East India Company had been, this powerful force that often hindered missionary activity. But once they were out of the picture, there was a lot more freedom for missionaries to operate.
And then you have the forced opening of Japan by Commodore Perry in 1853. Talk about a dramatic event.
Yeah, Japan had been closed off to the outside world for centuries, but Perry's arrival basically forced them to open their doors to trade and eventually to missionary activity.
And the treaties with China in the mid-19th century, those also opened up new opportunities, although under pretty controversial circumstances.
Yeah, those treaties were the result of the Opium Wars, which were, not exactly a shining moment in Western history, but they did open up China to Christian missions in a way that hadn't been possible before.
So a mix of progress and exploitation. It was a complicated time. And in America, you had the Second Evangelical Awakening, which had a huge impact on missions, right?
Oh, absolutely. It fueled this whole wave of missionary enthusiasm and led to the creation of a lot of new non-denominational mission societies.
So more and more people were feeling called to go out and spread the gospel. And among the many missionaries who were active during this time, uh, who stands out to you?
Well, there are so many inspiring figures from this era. There's Thomas Birch Freeman, a Methodist missionary who was incredibly effective in the Gold Coast, now Ghana. He was a real pioneer in developing indigenous leadership and establishing a self-supporting church there.
And Carl Gutzlaff, he was a real adventurer, wasn't he? Working in Southeast Asia and China, learning languages, adopting local customs. He was a bit of a controversial figure, but he definitely had an impact.
Yeah, he was a real trailblazer, and he inspired many other missionaries, including Hudson Taylor and David Livingstone. And speaking of Livingstone, I mean, who could forget him?
The famous explorer of Africa.
Exactly. He was a physician and a missionary, but he was also driven by this insatiable curiosity to explore and map the unknown regions of Africa. His expeditions opened up vast areas of the continent to Western knowledge and, paved the way for further missionary activity.
And his writings really captured the public imagination, sparking this whole wave of fascination with Africa and the missionary enterprise.
Yeah, he became a bit of a celebrity, and his book, Missionary Travels and Researches, was a bestseller.
So he was a scientist, an explorer, a missionary, and a celebrity. Quite a combination.
And then there was Henry Townsend, who did some amazing work among the Yoruba people in Nigeria. He was a strong advocate for collaboration between missionaries from different denominations, and he witnessed the historic rise of the first native Anglican bishop in Africa, Samuel Crowther.
And John Taylor Jones. He was the one who translated the New Testament into Siamese, now Thai.
Yeah, a monumental task. And his work was instrumental in spreading the gospel in Thailand, a country that had been largely resistant to Christian missions up to that point.
And then there was Alan Gardner, a former British naval commander who dedicated his life to missions, even though his efforts were ultimately unsuccessful.
Yeah, he was determined to reach the indigenous people of Tierra del Fuego, but he faced incredible challenges. Hostile weather, disease, starvation. He and his companions all died tragically, but his story became an inspiration to other missionaries, proving that some were willing to give their lives for the cause.
So even in failure, there can be inspiration. And what about C.G. Fander? He was a missionary who specialized in reaching out to Muslims, right?
Yeah, he was a scholar of Islam and a skilled debater. He wrote a famous book called Balance of Truth, which was widely used in missions to Muslims. And he was known for his very direct approach to engaging with Muslim scholars.
So he wasn't afraid of a good theological debate.
Not at all. He believed in the power of truth to prevail, and he wasn't afraid to challenge opposing viewpoints.
And then there's Ludwig Ingwer Nommensen, who did some amazing work in Sumatra. He's a great example of a missionary who really embraced the principles of indigenous church planting.
Yeah, he worked among the Batak people, and he was very intentional about developing local leadership, encouraging self-support, and adapting Christian practices to the local culture. He really believed in creating a church that was truly Batak, not just a copy of Western Christianity.
So a church that was rooted in the local soil, so to speak.
Exactly. And these are just a few of the many incredible individuals who were active during this period. It was a time of tremendous energy and innovation in missions.
So as we move into the latter part of the 19th century, what we often call the golden age of colonialist missions, how did the relationship between missions and colonialism play out?
Well, it was a complex and often fraught relationship. On the one hand, you have the expansion of European colonial powers, which opened up new territories to missionary activity. I mean, in many cases, missionaries were able to go places and reach people that they wouldn't have been able to reach otherwise.
So colonialism provided access, infrastructure, sometimes even protection for missionaries.
Exactly. But on the other hand, colonialism was often brutal and exploitative, and it created a lot of resentment among the colonized people. And unfortunately, Christianity sometimes became associated with colonialism, seen as a tool of Western domination.
So it's a mixed bag. The spread of the gospel sometimes went hand in hand with the spread of empire.
Yeah, and that created a lot of tension and ambiguity. And even though the principles of indigenous church planting, the ideas championed by Anderson, Venn, and Wayland were still being discussed and debated, There was a noticeable shift in the overall missionary mindset during this period.
What kind of shift?
Well, there was this growing sense of, I don't know, maybe pious paternalism is a good way to put it. Some historians have even called it benevolent imperialism. It's like missionaries still believed in empowering local churches, but they also felt this responsibility to, civilize the people they were trying to reach, to bring them Western education, medicine, social norms.
So a bit of a clash between those ideals of self-sufficiency and this urge to uplift or improve other cultures.
Exactly. And the core strategies of missions during this time, they still revolved around individual conversion, church planting, social transformation through evangelism, education, and medical work. But there were a lot of different opinions about how to engage with other religions. Some missionaries took a very confrontational approach, emphasizing the radical differences between Christianity and other faiths, while others tried to find common ground and build bridges.
So a lot of diversity of thought and approach, even within the missionary movement itself. And this period also saw a huge increase in the number of women serving as missionaries, right?
Oh, absolutely. The 1860s was a real turning point. Women were no longer content to just stay at home and support their husbands. They wanted to be on the front lines, and they had a huge impact, especially in the area of education for women and girls.
So they were challenging gender roles and expanding the scope of missionary work.
Exactly. And then you have the rise of faith missions, which became a real hallmark of this period.
Faith missions, what are those?
These were missionary organizations that relied entirely on, well, faith. They didn't have any guaranteed salaries or financial backing. They basically just trusted that God would provide for their needs through the donations of supporters.
So it was a pretty radical departure from the traditional model of missions, where missionaries were often supported by their denominations or by wealthy patrons.
Yeah, it was all about trusting God to provide, and it appealed to a lot of people who were looking for a more adventurous and, I guess you could say, a more authentic missionary experience.
And the most famous example of faith mission was the China Inland Mission, founded by James Hudson Taylor in 1865, right?